Well, climate change right now, if you talk to a farmer in any part of the world, in Africa, Asia, even in the US or in Australia, they're going to tell you the climate has changed over their lifetime. It's not the same as it used to be when they were younger. It's become more unpredictable, it's become more erratic. Rains don't come on time, they come either late or they come early. And it's very difficult for farmers to manage to predict what's going to happen and grow crops accordingly. And we're seeing it everywhere. The US had the biggest drought in their history last year.
I have seen the effect of climate change on the Arctic, where the ice is getting thinner and ice is retreating backwards. So glaciers are retreating and the ice cap is thinning. And that has real effects on the wildlife that depend on that ice, on the seals, on the polar bears, on all the wildlife, the birds and so on that depend on that. You also see it in the rainforests, where you see a drying out, where the people who live there talk about how nothing is quite the same anymore. Great patches that should be wet are not. Areas that should be very dry are becoming wet. Everything is shifting and changing.
Bangladesh is a country that has a huge experience of having already to adapt to climate. I've been here a few times. I've been down in the Bay of Bengal and I've seen the aftermath of the cyclone, the brackish water, the fact that both fisher folk and farmers have to change their way of doing, and it's difficult and needs training, and communities are learning to adapt to the fact that this is going to be a reality. They're going to have rising seawater, and they even predict that huge numbers will have to migrate. They're already migrating to Dhaka and elsewhere. And so this is a country with a lot of experience, but it's a very poor country. And it's the rich countries that have to take their responsibility and mitigate these greenhouse gas emissions that are causing the problem.
Is more extreme weather events. They're going to be more intense, tougher, wilder hurricanes, more droughts, more floods of an intensity that we've very rarely seen in the past. But this is going to be frequent, and it serves in a way as an early warning, rather like the canary in the coal mine, that we really need to take action and take it quickly.
40% of all the climate instability is coming from an industrial agriculture, which is also destroying the water systems and creating new vulnerability for food systems. We are not talking about vulnerability of the future. 2009, we had a severe drought in India.
For any given climatic impact, be it a flood or a drought or a hurricane, most of them, maybe 5, 6, 7, sometimes 8 out of 10 of the worst events occurred in the last 10 years.
The areas of real conflict arise where people depend quite literally one-to-one on the land. They're not removed from the land. They depend on what they grow in the soil, what crops they can get out, what fish they can get out of the sea. That's where the conflicts are beginning to arise. So when there are less fish to catch, conflicts arise between fishermen. Where there are less crops to grow, where the seasons are so out of kilter, people don't know when they can harvest their crops, or even if they will harvest their crops. Everybody gets a lot more stressed and a lot more conflict is beginning to happen.
Darfur, for example, lots of the fighting was around pasture land, and that was because of drought caused in part by climate change. Even the Arab Spring has often been attributed to the issue around food prices and access to food.
I've spent a lot of time with women's groups who deal with issues of women, peace and security. And each year I meet the Gender is My Agenda women's groups before the African Union, who have been discussing issues of conflict, of rape, of violence against women in conflict. And now they're beginning to talk about climate, because it is worsening the situation and they need to know about it and become more resilient. So there's a very big connection.
The impact of climate change is mostly going to affect the poorer people, the people already on the margins. And that will lead, obviously, to huge migratory pressures. It'll lead to a lot of resentment and the risk of really radical movements. We have a pretty clear idea that there's going to be a loss in the ecological carrying capacity of the tropical and subtropical croplands. What that really means is the capacity to grow food for people and for people to grow it themselves in subsistence farming is going to decline. And that really is something which is quite really very worrying.
If you have less and less stability in food production, you are getting more and more conflicts. Egypt, the first protests were around bread. Only later they became about Mubarak. These are all triggered by instability that begins with climate instability.
Well, I think anytime we think of the military as a solution, then we've lost the problem already. It comes in when we've failed. The military has to mop up afterwards. It's a failure of politicians to come to a negotiated agreement.
So in a sense, military solutions may seem to be attractive in the short term, but they're no answer because they're not really at the root. They're treating the symptoms, not the causes.
Unfortunately, they may not be coming from either a human rights or gender perspective, and they may try to just simply make the richer parts of the world fortresses that people cannot enter. That would be very foolish, because the prediction about climate change is that by 2050 we could have 200 million people displaced by the impacts and shocks of climate change. And you can't stop that kind of movement of people.
I don't think there's a military solution to what has been created by a militarized mind, a mind that has unleashed a war against the earth.
The impact that the military itself and war has on the environment, not just the destruction of landscapes, but the emissions. I mean, carbon emissions are massive. If that money, the money that goes into military preparation, military spending, were diverted to resilience in local communities to climate change and to mitigating the effects of climate change through investment in renewable energy, through investment in sustainability and insulation of homes, all of those things, you're both reducing the likelihood of war and responding to climate change, because I think those two are really interlinked.
A UN report just recently had 3 out of 4 countries putting climate change as one of their key priorities in terms of their own national security strategies. So I think there really is a growing awareness that climate change isn't just an environmental issue. It is, in fact, the biggest threat to our collective security that we face. And therefore, what I would hope to see would be, even if we had a fraction of the amount of money that's currently going into military budgets, instead going into budgets to make our countries more resilient in the face of climate change, and also to reduce the causes of climate change, in other words, to change our energy systems. That would be the single most important thing we could do to make the whole world a much safer place.
When you lay out figures in front of them that say billions of pounds replacing an out-of-date nuclear system, or billions of pounds investing in securing, a sustainable world for future generations, the choice is pretty obvious.
We've got to move to economies which were far more equitable, far more emancipatory and far more just, because the world economy simply isn't working at present. It's not delivering economic justice. And there's a very strong case for trying to do that at the same time as moving to really low carbon economies as well. You put those together and it means an economic transformation, which can certainly include moving away from the high levels of military spending, but focusing very much on more equity and an ultra low carbon way of living.
The resource grab by oil companies, by mining companies for the last bit of oil, the last bit of iron ore, bauxite, coal, to run a non-sustainable system.
Some of the conflicts that we have seen in the past in the region, or in other places, it's mainly due to conflicts around water resources. And so without a very clear water resource management plan for the Zambezi Basin, for instance, and countries like Zambia allowing uncontrolled mining or exploration happening that could potentially cause damage to the Zambezi, there is, a possibility of conflict with other countries that depend on the Zambezi.
We in richer countries are contributing to those problems by consuming unsustainably, by emitting greenhouse gases at far higher levels than are sustainable by various other practices like exporting weapons to countries that have very poor human rights records, and we've seen that in the Middle East and North Africa with the various uprisings in countries that we've supplied the weapons.
In fact, when it comes to what we need to do, there's no real debate about some of the political priorities. What's missing is the urgency, the political will to put those solutions in place.
I have to hope that we are beginning to realise how important it is that we work together on this, that we do have the political will. It's not there yet. Young people's voice can be very important in this, because we have to find ways to counter all the difficulties within countries, and they are very real, and actually have a global shared response to this, but not an equal response. The countries that have benefited from coal and oil and are still looking for more coal and oil in different parts of the world, including the Arctic, that we understand that we have to move dramatically from that kind of way of producing energy to the clean energy.
To my mind, really going down the nuclear power route is a diversion from the real issues, and also, of course, nuclear power and civil nuclear weapons are related, and we need to make sure that we move towards a safer world where nuclear power, nuclear weapons are not there at all.
One of the things we have to do in the next decade or so is hugely increase the way we use energy, the efficiency of the way we use energy. It's going to be a key aspect of tackling climate change. We're here at the Bradford University campus, which is being transformed into a remarkably energy efficient set of buildings. Behind me is the Sustainable Enterprise Centre, which is nearing completion.
Wanting both to reduce my environmental impact to what is a sustainable level, but also demonstrate to others that it can be done and you can still have a comfortable life. And it's a very comfortable house I live in. It's the nicest house I've ever lived in, and it's also the most environmentally friendly. Don't waste food. One of the biggest environmental impacts is of food that is produced and then we throw it away. So not wasting food, but also buying local and seasonable veg, eating less meat reduces your environmental impact.
When I started looking in Watford, where I live, for locally grown food, locally produced food initiatives, it was amazing how much there actually is already that we didn't know about, that isn't particularly well promoted. And then we saw something that we could do, my group, was to kind of link these initiatives up.
What people are saying from all over the world is that now there is gaining experience on looking at impacts of climate change and adapting, and communities around the world are doing it in their thousands now. And the challenge for us is to make this go from the thousands to the millions and to mainstream it into government. It's still not within government. Most of the effort is civil society and NGO led.
And so we need a climate agreement by the end of 2015, and then we need sustainable goals. We need to change our habits in the rich world about how we consume, how we produce, how we talk about growth. And young people are very good at understanding this, and I'm very encouraged. In fact, the one thing that gives me hope is the way that young people can make a difference.
Actually have so much more power than we give ourselves credit for, and it's only until you start believing and realizing you have power and that you can actually change things, that change will actually happen. And it wasn't until I got out on the streets myself, started going to demos, started petitioning people, started doing things, that I really felt more like I was taking control of the situation, even to come here today and be still involved in different various movements.
The positive way of looking at things is that this is one of the greatest opportunities we've ever had for real change, and for people to come together and rally behind something that's a big threat for everybody all across the world, regardless of where you're from or what your background is.
I think if people organise themselves in many different kinds of groups, they can be very positive, but they always have to see themselves as part of a bigger thing. You have to avoid the competition between groups. One says, we know what's right and what has to be done, another says something else, and be prepared to work together and cooperate. But different groups will do it in different ways, and I don't think there's any bad thing about that.
Well, we who work on vulnerable communities, we try to bring our voices to the international platforms, both through our own governments and leaders, as well as the global leaders at the global meetings like the Framework Convention, conferences of parties. But people in the developed countries who have a greater responsibility than the vulnerable and poor also have to do what they can, again, both within their own countries to push their own politicians and leaders to take action.
Do whatever we can to make sure that climate change is being addressed urgently and is being done in an equitable way that will actually bring a climate justice future that we want. Hello. Hi, I'm Caroline. Nice to meet you. Love to see you, Caroline. Good to see you.
I think it means taking every step that you possibly can to make sure that we act fast enough, because the climate crisis is a very urgent crisis. The next 5 or 10 years on their own are going to be crucial.
So it's very important to get active in campaigns. It may be a big national campaign that appeals to something about climate change, but it may be something local about protecting wildlife in your area. All these things contribute.
Young people, I think, have to get very engaged, have to get angry about the lack of progress, as young people can, and actually use social media and make sure their voices are heard on this issue.
We will come up with the answer, and if any of the energy that was diverted into producing weapons, looking harder and further for more fossil fuels to dig out of the ground, if any of that resource and ingenuity was put into really thinking about how do we decarbonise, I think it would be amazing what we could achieve.
Because all over the world, it's young people who will bear the brunt of it as they come into adulthood in a world that will be much more volatile, much more affected by climate shocks. The World Bank reports that if we have a 4-degree world, it could be catastrophic, and yet we're kind of moving in that direction.
We're all on the same planet. They don't have a separate planet to go to, and they can't throw us off this one. So we're all going to have to solve this problem together.